Stop me if you've seen A Few Good Men. A group of service members sneak into their buddy's bedroom in the middle of the night to do a bit of corrective action. When day breaks miles away from American shores, a mysterious death nearly gets papered over, ignored, or under-investigated. But 4 service members serving in Africa failed to learn any lessons from Tom Cruise, Jack Nicholson, or Kevin Bacon. When they perceived social slights and felt ignored by their buddy, they took it upon themselves to correct him, to teach him some social graces. In the process of teaching Army Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar a lesson on social graces, Naval Petty Officer First Class DeDolph killed him. This is Conduct and Becoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Anthony Tony DeDolph grew up in Wisconsin and enlisted in the Navy in 2004. He was, as he asserts, inspired to join following the 9/11 attacks and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He had both a college degree and a job at a laboratory, but he decided to enlist to try his luck at becoming a SEAL. He sustained a few injuries which resulted in him going through Hell Week 3 times. But he persevered. He was a SEAL, a member of SEAL Team 6. DeDolph went on several combat deployments, and by all accounts, he had a very successful career in the Navy and was highly decorated. In January 2017, DeDolph re-enlisted. He signed on to do another 4 years as a Navy SEAL. That same year, DeDolph and others traveled to Mali on counter-terrorism orders. While his exact role in the African country was not disclosed in any of the record of trial or in the opinion, other U.S. Special Forces had been in the area to support and train local troops in the fight against extremists. In Bamako, Mali, DeDolph and other service members lived in a guarded compound with a number of buildings within it. One house was referred to as the Marine House, and another was the Army-Navy House. Given that arrangement, Army Staff Sergeant Melgar, a Texas native and Army Green Beret, lived in the same house as DeDolph. On June 3, 2017, DeDolph and Special Operator Second Class Matthews learned that Staff Sergeant Melgar, Gunnery Sergeant Madera Rodriguez, and Private Maxwell were out at a local bar, and they decided to join them and make a night of it. After they arrived, DeDolph and Matthews learned that Melgar ditched Madera Rodriguez and Maxwell to go to an embassy party. This perceived slight was enough to get the men thinking. They didn't like being ditched. They decided the solution was to get together for what they referred to as a tape job. It was, as DeDolph described, intended to be lighthearted frivolity, simple teasing, and maybe some playful roughhousing. A little light hazing, if we're to believe them. After the group hopped to another bar, the details of their plan began to materialize. They planned to bind Melgar with duct tape, apply a chokehold to knock him out, put him in a sexually vulnerable position, and film it to show Melgar later. In Greek life in college, I remember our advisors explaining that inviting our sisters, new and old, to go on a photo scavenger hunt in Los Angeles could be hazing and was strictly verboten. It's a bit wild to think that a tape job and a photo scavenger hunt fall under the same umbrella and definition of hazing. Everyone in their little raiding party had a role to play. DeDolph was responsible for administering the rear naked chokehold, the hold that would restrict the blood flowing to Melgar's head and cause him to lose consciousness. Marine Private Maxwell was in charge of raising the mosquito netting around Melgar's bed and securing Melgar's arms and legs with tape. They planned to bring in one of the quarters guards in a mask and invite him to pretend to molest Melgar while he was unconscious. They convinced the guard to take off his shirt and wear a leash in addition to the face mask to, really sell the story. The guard, who didn't speak much English, later explained that while he did not want to do what they asked, he feared he might lose his job if he did not go along with it. The men put their plan into action later that night, or I suppose the early morning hours of June 4th, 2017. They first visited the Marine quarters at around 5 a.m. to pick up duct tape, handcuffs, and a sledgehammer. Then they drove to the shared Army-Navy quarters. 30 minutes after they arrived at the quarters, the men broke into Melgar's locked room with a sledgehammer. Melgar, whose rowdy night at the embassy party ended well before the bar-hopping groups, was asleep when his supposed friends broke in. Melgar, startled awake by the forced entry while he slept, stood and appeared frightened. The men charged at the bed, ripping some of the bedding and the mosquito net, and worked together to restrain Melgar. DeDolph administered the chokehold, a move he'd practiced a number of times in training. Melgar came to as the four were finishing up binding him, so DeDolph administered a second chokehold from behind Melgar. This time, Melgar's face was pressed down into his bed. With his hands bound, Melgar couldn't tap out and couldn't squeeze out words, given the arm pressed against both sides of his neck. I don't know that either would have made a difference. Melgar lost consciousness in an estimated 10 seconds. But after 30 or so seconds passed, he failed to wake up. As the men realized Melgar wasn't breathing, they began to unbind him and attempt resuscitation efforts. First, DeDolph attempted CPR, while someone went down the hall to wake Melgar's team leader. DeDolph hadn't acted as a medic in years, but I suppose he was the best situated to try and sustain Melgar's life. At 6:04, one of the local guards called the embassy to summon assistance. When CPR was unsuccessful, DeDolph first retrieved an AED, then shifted tactics and attempted a cricothyrotomy, a surgical procedure that involves making an incision in the cricothyroid membrane and inserting a tube through the vocal cords and into the trachea to establish an airway. If you've watched enough high-drama television, you've probably seen people on screen somehow successfully completing the procedure with a ballpoint pen. DeDolph made the initial incision, but found it difficult to insert the breathing tube, finding some sort of blockage. Later, doctors speculated this obstruction was the crushed windpipe Melgar sustained while restrained. The group loaded Melgar into a Land Rover to move him to a local clinic for additional medical support. DeDolph moved with him, making additional incisions into his airway before finally successfully inserting a breathing tube. Hurtling along poorly maintained roads didn't make the high-stress procedure more successful, and the resultant incisions were jagged. When they arrived at the local clinic, a doctor examined Melgar and explained that he couldn't help. DeDolph continued breathing for Melgar using the inserted breathing tube until a doctor from the embassy arrived and pronounced Melgar dead. Following Melgar's death, the men worked to get their story straight. DeDolph said he didn't want Melgar's death to be remembered as a hazing incident. He didn't think it would be fair to Melgar or his memory, and he didn't want Melgar's family to think about him dying taped up on the floor. They decided they would tell investigators that only DeDolph and Matthews were present during the incident. They decided to lie and omit any mention of the Marines that had been with them, Gunnery Sergeant Madera Rodriguez and Private Maxwell. They would tell investigators that DeDolph and Melgar were play fighting when suddenly Melgar experienced a spontaneous medical emergency and became unresponsive. They destroyed the phone that contained pictures of Melgar bound with tape and disposed of the alcohol in the shared Army and Navy quarters. When they spoke with investigators, they didn't mention the duct tape. Gunnery Sergeant Madera Rodriguez worked to stick to this script and described Melgar emerging from his bedroom and instigating a wrestling match with DeDolph. Madera Rodriguez said his view of the wrestling became obstructed and that he remained outside the door, not witnessing anything, until someone emerged and told him Melgar was unresponsive. It took the Army's Criminal Investigations Division, CID, a few days to arrive in Mali to investigate Melgar's death. But when they arrived to investigate, DeDolph had already been pulled from Mali. He was removed from his team, returned to Virginia, and put to work in the shipping and receiving department. We're taking a brief detour because I found an interesting subplot in the redacted record. In the first few weeks of their investigation, CID spoke with someone I'll refer to as Sierra. Sierra's real name was redacted, as were any details about her job and whether she was herself a service member. The motions describe Sierra as being in Mali because of her employer, so I don't think she's a service member, but I can't be completely certain. Sierra had, it seems, spoken with the men planning the tape job. When she woke in the morning, she texted someone in the group to ask how the, quote, operation had gone. When she learned of just how poorly the tape job went, she informed her management of the incident. Her management asked her to please stay at the U.S. Embassy until she could be flown to Washington, D.C. that evening. When she landed in or near D.C., she spoke with her management team and her employer's lawyers about what happened. In the weeks after talking to her employer and their counsel, and after speaking to CID, Sierra waited for CID to reach out. When she heard nothing, Sierra asked counsel for her employer to reach out to CID proactively and make sure that they knew she was a witness in the case. Then she submitted a written statement to CID. Shortly after CID received Sierra's statement, they transferred the investigation to NCIS. Sierra thought she could be of use to the investigation, given her background and purportedly specialized training that she'd received from her employer. The record certainly doesn't come out and say it, but it seems possible that Sierra worked for her own alphabet soup acronym organization. She offered to participate in an operation to elicit information from individuals who would not be otherwise willing to talk. She apparently described eliciting information as something that came naturally to her because of her employment. In order to make use of all of these specialized skills, Sierra became a confidential informant, then began a romantic relationship with the NCIS special agent investigating Melgar's death. This did not stop her from participating in operations to get information from witnesses. Neither Sierra nor the NCIS special agent disclosed the relationship to their employers, or the special agent's wife. When the affair later came to light, the subsequent upheaval was apparently a real bummer for Sierra and fodder for a slew of defense motions. But let's get back to our main players. In August 2017, the Navy announced that DeDolph was selected for promotion to E7. The following month, Melgar's cause of death was classified as homicide, 3 months after DeDolph strangled him and after an autopsy concluded that Melgar died of asphyxiation and had suffered a fractured windpipe. Following the classification of Melgar's death as a homicide and forensic analysis that revealed DeDolph's DNA on the duct tape used to restrain Melgar during the incident, DeDolph promoted. In November 2018, Navy prosecutors charged DeDolph with conspiracy to commit assault consummated by battery, conspiracy to obstruct justice, burglary, felony murder, involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and hazing. They charged the felony murder because Melgar died in the commission of a felony, the burglary. Burglary, under the UCMJ at the time the offense was committed, required entering a dwelling at night. The record is replete with arguments about which sunrise to use in order to define nighttime. It seems burglary has been cleaned up in the recent updates to the UCMJ, and Article 129 no longer lists nighttime as an essential element of burglary. Following these charges, stories spread rapidly about Melgar's death and quickly evolved. One article claimed DeDolph killed Melgar to prevent him from reporting alleged embezzlement, though evidence in the investigation doesn't seem to have borne that out. 2 of DeDolph's co-conspirators accepted plea agreements, and one, Gunnery Sergeant Madera Rodriguez, pled not guilty at a contested general court-martial. A panel nevertheless convicted him of conspiracy to commit assault, conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, housebreaking, involuntary manslaughter, and hazing. He was sentenced to 6 months confinement, reduction to E1, 90 days of hard labor, and a letter of reprimand. Special Operator 2nd Class Matthews pled guilty to conspiracy to commit assault, conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful entry, assault consummated by battery, hazing, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 12 months confinement, reduction to E5, and a bad conduct discharge. Private Maxwell pled guilty to negligent homicide and hazing, and agreed to testify against DeDolph and his other co-conspirators. He received a sentence of 4 years confinement, reduction to E1, and a bad conduct discharge. Finally, in January 2021, DeDolph pled guilty to conspiracy to commit assault consummated by battery, conspiracy to obstruct justice, involuntary manslaughter, hazing, and obstruction of justice. In return, the convening authority agreed to withdraw and dismiss charges of burglary, felony murder, and failure to obey a lawful order, and capped his confinement at 15 years. At his sentencing, the government called 11 witnesses, including Private Maxwell. Maxwell was the only co-conspirator to testify for the government. A doctor testified for the government and offered that, perhaps, DeDolph performed the emergency cricothyrotomy to destroy evidence of how Melgar died, a first crack at obstructing justice. DeDolph later asserted that eliciting testimony of this nature and making argument about it constituted prosecutorial misconduct. DeDolph also elected to take the stand. He described Melgar choosing an embassy party over bar hopping, and the elaborate hazing plot the men concocted to teach him a lesson. He testified to twice placing Melgar in a chokehold, and to the number of life-saving measures he attempted. He apologized to Melgar's teammates and to his widow, saying, "I'm responsible for the death of your husband. I'm responsible for the pain that you and your children have. And to the men behind you, I'm responsible for the loss of your teammate, and I'm sorry. And I know that words can do no justice. I'm sorry, and I pray that you forgive me. DeDolph elected to be sentenced by a panel. He submitted more than 60 written letters from family, friends, and colleagues. In total, he provided over 180 pages for the members to review, in the hopes they would agree that his history, his decoration, his past heroism, meant he should be spared in some way. The military judge sent the panel out for deliberation at 1:19 p.m. They returned a sentence less than 2 hours later at 3:10 p.m. I don't think they made it through the entire defense binder. The panel sentenced DeDolph to 10 years confinement, reduction to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. On appeal, DeDolph asserted 6 assignments of error. First, he raised a concern about the plea deal Private Maxwell struck. Specifically, he alleged the prosecutors tainted the sentencing hearing by not disclosing Maxwell's attempt to seek additional clemency. Second, he asserted the military judge admitted improper evidence in aggravation. Third, he asserted his sentence was inappropriately severe as compared to his co-conspirators. Fourth, he alleged the government committed prosecutorial misconduct. Fifth, he claimed the military judge abused his discretion when he denied DeDolph's motion for a mistrial. Finally, he complained of cumulative error. Cumulative error requires finding a series of errors, none of which are enough on their own to merit reversal, but, when combined, merit relief. At issue in the first assignment of error was Private Maxwell, the only co-conspirator who testified for the government. DeDolph argued that because Maxwell sought additional clemency in exchange for his testimony, it indicated that he might not be a credible witness and could demonstrate that he was biased. A month after Maxwell received his own sentence of 4 years, he requested an extension on his opportunity to request clemency. He wanted the convening authority to wait until his full cooperation was complete and a matter of court record. Trial counsel submitted a letter attesting that Maxwell provided material assistance in the case surrounding Melgar's death. The convening authority granted the extension. When Maxwell testified, neither the government nor DeDolph questioned him about his pretrial agreement or the sentence he received. But at that sentencing, Maxwell described the assault on Melgar, including a detailed account of DeDolph's methods of rendering Melgar unconscious and painting DeDolph as functionally the ringleader. Following this testimony and DeDolph's sentencing, the government endorsed Maxwell's clemency request, and the convening authority reduced Maxwell's confinement from 4 years to 3. In determining whether the government committed a Brady violation by failing to turn over this evidence of the clemency request to the defense, the Navy and Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals had to evaluate, first, whether the information at issue was subject to disclosure or discovery, and second, what effect, if any, the non-disclosure had upon the trial. Evidence that might reveal a bias or inconsistency for a witness is always material, and DeDolph had specifically requested discovery of evidence or information that affected the credibility of any potential government witness. When Maxwell asked for an extension to file his clemency request, it could be reasonable to assume that the quality of his performance might impact whether or how the government endorsed his request. And DeDolph never got the opportunity to inquire if that was, in fact, true, to determine if Maxwell had an incentive to really play things up at DeDolph's sentencing hearing. So, on the second question of how the non-disclosure of the clemency request affected the court-martial, the court evaluated whether the error was harmful or harmless beyond a reasonable doubt. The NMCCA was unpersuaded by the government's argument. They observed that Maxwell was a central witness to the government's sentencing case. They concluded that failing to disclose Maxwell's clemency request was reversible error under any standard. It didn't actually matter to them that DeDolph never cross-examined Maxwell about his potential bias as it related to his testimonial immunity. This error was sufficient to reverse the judgment and remand it for resentencing, though the court issued a lengthy opinion that walked through DeDolph's other claimed errors. None of the other errors warranted relief. Many of the asserted errors failed to contradict the stipulation of fact or impeach the court's finding that DeDolph's chokehold caused Melgar's death. The NMCCA sent the case back to a military judge for resentencing. For his resentencing, DeDolph hired an attorney that previously worked for former President Trump. The attorney's lack of a security clearance complicated coordinating his access to the classified materials that he needed to access in order to competently represent DeDolph. These access issues led to an approximately 4-month delay in the resentencing process. But on October 6, 2023, a military judge sentenced DeDolph to just 18 months confinement, reduction to E4, and a bad conduct discharge. Though it's not mentioned anywhere that I can find it, I suspect this was pursuant to further plea agreement. Altogether, that means DeDolph, who administered the fatal chokehold, received a sentence with half as much confinement time as Maxwell, who'd bound Melgar with duct tape. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we learn about what it takes to catch a predator. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.